My name is Gerard Kennedy. I am the chair of the Distinguished Visitors Committee here in the Faculty of Law at the University of Manitoba. We acknowledge that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes that pass, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. We are enormously fortunate today to have our first lecturer in our Distinguished Visitors Series here in the Faculty of Law at the University of Manitoba. And we are delighted to welcome Dr. Carol Liao, who will speak to us on sustainable corporate law and its intersections with feminism and critical race theory. Dr. Liao is an associate professor and the director of the Center for Business Law at the Peter A. Allard School of Law at the University of British Columbia. She is also the distinguished scholar of the Dhillon Center for Business Ethics at the UBC Sauder School of Business and the principal co-investigator of the Canada Climate Law Initiative. Prior to entering academia, she was a senior corporate lawyer in New York, and this year she received the Influential Women in Business Award and was recently named as one of Canada's top 100 most powerful women by the Women's Enterprise Network. So I can really think of no one better suited to give this lecture, and we're deeply honored to have her. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Liao.
Thank you so much, Gerard. That's so nice of you. And let me get my screen up. Can you see that? Yeah, everyone? Okay, great. So thank you so much for inviting me here today. It's really a genuine honor to get to kick off the Distinguished Visitor Lecture Series at Robson Hall. I'm joining from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, where I'm grateful to work and live. And I'm thrilled to be given this opportunity to share some of my research that I've been working on. You know, and my talk today is really a high-level overview of some of the themes that connect several of my current projects. And I want to give credit to some of those people in those projects before I start, including a co-authored paper I'm working on with Jennifer Quaid at the University of Ottawa on corporate accountability, and 2 collections I'm putting out with Beate Schaafgel at the University of Oslo on sustainable business, as well as my work being done at the Canada Climate Law Initiative and the equity work that I've been doing for the past several years with my industry partner, Shona McGlashan, who is the Vice President of Governance at Vancity. And so my intention for this talk is to form the basis of a chapter that I have promised for a book edited by Christopher Bruner and Mark Moore called A Research Agenda for Corporate Law, published by Edward Elgar. And the chapter will offer my latest thinking on where corporate law needs to go. So I very much welcome your comments. So to start, it helps if I click there. You know, I'm going to assume that we're all on the same page in terms of understanding that climate change is real. In 2018, the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out with its damning report in a series of reports. And, you know, since consensus is required across these 195 scientists from around the world, the IPCC report can be said to be a conservative estimate of what's happening in our climate emergency. You know, and the IPCC has been clear in stating that the world is failing in its efforts to avert catastrophic climate change, and without unprecedented shifts by 2030 or sooner, there will be a greater rate of species extinction and climate-related refugees and deaths. You know, the world is literally on fire. Over the past several decades, as the world has increasingly warmed, so has its potential to burn. The places in the world where climate change has not yet touched are shrinking. We have seen the bushfires in Australia, typhoons and hurricanes, melting polar ice caps, hottest temperatures on record. You know, to personalize this a bit, from my hometown of Vancouver, each year the summers are increasingly hotter, smoke-filled air and orange skies from fires along the West Coast have become an annual occurrence. And this past summer in BC, we had 569 heat-related deaths, with 445 of them during our news-making heat dome. During that time, we had the town of Lytton burned to the ground, decimated by fire. Climate change has significantly increased the likelihood of these heat domes happening in the future. And along with this, of course, we have our pandemic, and the root causes of future pandemics are going to be inseparable from climate changes: deforestation, biodiversity loss, food scarcity, are going to force animals to migrate out of their natural habitats, increasing infectious zoonotic disease risk in humans. So that's the reality and the depressing part that I think a lot of us, know by now, right? And increased awareness of these risks in some circles is quite necessary, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But this year, the IPCC updated its assessment from 2018, finding that temperatures are rising faster than anticipated. Climate change is widespread, rapid, and intensifying, and we must engage in transformational change across industries and institutions. So my focus is on corporate law, right? And it's difficult to deny that corporations play a monstrous role in our efforts, or lack thereof, to combat climate change, right? Corporations are increasingly rivaling the state in institutional power and influence. Some multinational corporations' power now dwarfs that of many governments in terms of financial resources, capital mobility, technological know-how, scalability, and political influence. So knowing that, when we think about our climate, this climate emergency, and how society can achieve a fair and responsible transition to a net zero carbon future, and what the role is for business, we face a few challenges in achieving that transformational, urgent change that's needed, right? And one of the challenges is in our framing of the issues and what gets popularized as problems in Anglo-American corporate academia, and now to unpack that a bit, fiduciary duties are a major part of corporate law and a major part of being lawyers, right? It defines the legal and ethical relationship of trust that a fiduciary owes to another party. And for anyone wanting to pursue corporate law as a doctorate in most Anglo-American countries, at least, they must all get introduced to a debate that is often centered around whether boards have duties to the best interests of the shareholders, often crudely translated to mean profits, or not. And that old and tired debate surprisingly carries on with great vigor in corporate circles, so much so that in 2020, with the pandemic, climate change, racial justice on the forefront of people's minds, Oxford and Cambridge hosted the great debate with the question, should corporate leaders manage their companies for their shareholders or all their stakeholders? And I say this, not to make light, but to emphasize how far behind corporate boardrooms are in understanding the legalities of their fiduciary duties to the planet, and how poorly a great deal of corporate legal scholarship has been in reframing the important questions that need to be asked and answered. Because the question isn't shareholder versus stakeholder, and winning some circular business case argument is not going to get us to net zero anytime soon. In fact, it assures us of a 4-degree future, whether a narrowly defined focus on increasing shareholder wealth or a stakeholder approach to management is going to increase the value of your company, is with respect, it's a boring argument. And corporate law scholars and even former Delaware court judges, have made careers and legacies out of debating this issue. And just to do away with it quickly, in Canada, directors are not agents to the shareholders, and their duties are to the best interests of the corporation, viewed as a good corporate citizen. And in their decision-making, boards and management certainly should consider their stakeholders, particularly since we have a range of stakeholder remedies available in Canada, notably the oppression remedy, but I digress. In the context of climate specifically, the work my colleagues and I are doing at the Canada Climate Law Initiative, where I am a principal co-investigator, along with my fellow co-PIs, Professors Janice Serra and Cynthia Williams, two behemoths in the field, which I couldn't be more honored to be affiliated with. the CCLI has the mission of ensuring Canadian directors and trustees understand their fiduciary obligations with respect to climate change. And, so the one thing we are very proud of is that the CCLI has clearly clarified and settled any debate in Canada on whether climate governance is part of a board's fiduciary duty. Canadian courts have given judicial notice that climate change is real. Judicial notice, of course, is when that fact is so well known and proven that it cannot reasonably be doubted, and you don't need to spend the time to prove it in court. The CCLI aims to provide directors with free access to resources to help them govern in the area of climate-related risks and opportunities. The Supreme Court has held that climate change is, and I quote, a threat of the highest order to the country and indeed the world. And having a climate change denier on your board is not adding to a diversity of perspectives. It's that directors reneging on their duty of care to the corporation, as directors are required to exercise the care, diligence, and skill that a reasonably prudent person would exercise in comparable circumstances. Now, the CCLI has commissioned legal opinions from well-respected lawyers in Canada, confirming that in executing their duties, Canadian directors are obliged to be proactive and critically evaluate and address the material risks and opportunities associated with climate change. These are legal opinions, which is, as we know, is different than an op-ed or a Twitter thread. It means that they're providing their legal conclusions that allow the recipient to rely on that opinion. And those legal opinions are publicly available on our website, along with some of the recordings of the over 664 events and webinars that we've hosted on climate governance, 10 reports, 6 executive education programs, over 50 board presentations delivered by our climate governance experts that we've amassed, educating close to 400 directors in the past year on climate governance, resilience, and risks specific to their particular industries. So, any boards interested in free presentations on effective climate governance can contact us through our website, and we're really grateful to our funders who've enabled us to do this important work. But in the context of where corporate law needs to go, I have a few observations, okay? Corporate law to date, it's largely unable to respond to the regulatory gaps that arise from complex Earth system challenges. The CCLI is trying to combat misperceptions of the law, but are also bound by laws that are colonial in nature and do not integrate stewardship or sustainability in their systems, right? Carol Hansel, in her legal opinion that we commissioned, makes the very honest point on the limitations, which is that her legal opinion and her focus is not on what the corporation is doing to the environment and the communities in which it operates, not what the organizations do to the earth, but rather what the earth is doing to the organization. We are disseminating what is now a reaction in corporate law, measuring the risks put upon the corporation, okay? Our finding is that climate change is so bad now that boards have an obligation to put climate risk on the agenda. And so in unpacking that, I've been thinking a lot about structural change, and the IPCC observes that one of our great challenges is the governance capacity of institutions to develop, implement, and evaluate the changes needed within diverse and highly interlinked global socio-ecological systems. And that policy arenas, governance structures, and robust institutions are key enabling conditions for transformative climate action. Okay, so, there's no doubt that a scientific consensus exists on the issue of climate change. The debate's no longer about the science. It's on values, culture, and ideology. And so in thinking about structural change, I think about power, right? I teach about it in my business law courses because many legal concepts address different power dynamics in governance. We talk about directors, officers, shareholders, other stakeholders having certain powers. but other notions of power have a pervasive impact on human ordering and sometimes are foundational to our organizational structures. None of us live in our own self-determined island. Ideas get passed down to us in concept form from generation to generation, as does intergenerational wealth and power. And we need to be cognizant of our very gendered and colonial histories and the norms that perpetuate themselves in corporate culture and affect the decisions that corporations make every day, directly and indirectly influencing the ways in which issues are identified as problems, how those problems are solved, and whose interests have been deemed worthy of being protected. And these norms can also subvert women, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and other historically marginalized groups from reaching positions of power in business, and can also inform the priorities within these companies. So, we need to recognize that we're all situated in these contexts, right? This notion of situatedness, which I credit my dear former colleague, Darlene Johnson, for, who, as an Indigenous woman in academia, I can tell you, thought about this every time she had to teach property law, situate herself with her students and remind them that they are situated too, right? There needs to be an understanding of context and that everyone is situated, not just those in the minority, and stereotypes are influencers of believability, legitimacy, and authority, and can dictate not only who's allowed to have a voice in debates, but the very framing of those debates. And so thinking along the lines of the social movements that we have seen, it's important to understand, for example, that sexual harassment doesn't exist as isolated behavior. Me Too wasn't just about sex, but how we value women as a whole. And in May of last year, when George Floyd and Black Lives Matter ignited the world to acknowledge the racial injustice that we need to understand that racism also does not exist in isolated behavior, but is reflective of what's been built into our systems that came from a very checkered and violent history. So we need to talk about race because racism exists. And critical race theory seeks to examine the intersection of race and the law. And the concern I have is in the seeming neutrality in which we treat corporate law, something that I think isn't explored enough when compared to other fields of law and scholarship that surround it. And as corporations are really creatures of the law and depend on the law for their existence, what would a critical race feminist perspective on corporate law look like? And so I suppose, when you think about how power is dispersed in society, the question is, will this allocation of power meaningfully be shared across gender and racial lines in the foreseeable future? And so I divide my critique in terms of both change within those institutions and the individual impacts that collectively show the racial and gender disparities that flow from structural inequalities, which then get represented in power and leadership positions. And then I ask, how structurally can we reform corporate law going forward to take into account an equitable space for us all and ensures climate justice and that we respect our Earth systems and planetary boundaries? How have our very gendered and colonial histories reverberated in our corporate boardrooms, including who's in the room, and also influencing, again, what issues we identify as problems, how those problems are solved, and whose interests we deem worthy of being protected. And the truth is, just looking sheerly at numbers, right? The numbers are pretty stark. Board seats are one way to measure power in Canada, and despite all the hype about diversity, and we have what's called a comply or explain regime in Canada, meaning public company boards are required to disclose gender diversity numbers. We have that in most provinces, and it was implemented in Ontario in 2015, and federally, as of last year, CBCA, Canada Business Corporations Act companies, federal companies, also have diversity disclosure reporting requirements. And with all that talk and with all that movement, the change has been incremental. And as for CEOs, less than 5% are women. Okay, so very easy to spin these numbers by highlighting them as an improvement from the year before. But these are the best numbers. It's far worse in private companies where there's far less gendered representation and no mandatory disclosure. And in terms of nonprofits, actually women are overrepresented in unpaid, smaller nonprofits, but that actually decreases in larger, more prominent nonprofits and charities. So it seems the more powerful the nonprofit, the less women. So gender parity is very far off, right? And these rates, it's not going to happen in my children's lifetime. The status quo just isn't cutting it. And I've included information about race and Indigenous peoples here too, because first of all, I'm glad that information is available, and kudos to Andrew McDougall and his team at Osler for compiling this data each year. I love updating my slides each year by fractions of a percent, right? 4.4 turns to 4.8, right? And we need to recognize, though, that we're still taking baby steps when it comes to diversity. Like gender a few years back was treated like all we seem to be able to handle in terms of manageability of a problem. And as many regulatory agencies claimed, right? Yet diversity is so much broader, and it's good to see the CBCA and some other jurisdictions like in California aiming to extend the mandate, because an intersectional understanding of diversity is important. Also regarding racialized persons, note in 2012, it was 2.8%. It took 5 years to get to 3.3, and again, years to get to the 6.8 that we're at now. But more than 1.1 in 5 Canadians is racialized, and in urban areas, the numbers are much higher. And, I'm sorry, because many of us here are academics, I also couldn't resist these stats. These are from 2019, from the 15 largest Canadian universities. Left graphic looks at senior leadership, showing that most senior leadership is overwhelmingly white and largely male, with minimal representation of racialized men, with less than 9% and less than 1% for racialized women or Indigenous men. And in fact, no Indigenous women appear in this chart. And so while we see some gains have been made on gender equity in universities, that is not the case for visible minorities, and especially Black and Indigenous women and men. And on the right, you see the dean's numbers, which just emphasizes the lack of racial diversity at the top. And here are pipeline numbers from UBC, UVic, SFU, U of T, and York. You can see the pipeline is very leaky for racialized minorities, hitting a ceiling at the associate dean level. And the numbers for Indigenous men and women is negligible. There's a notable overrepresentation of white men and women in these leadership ranks. And so while the numbers are improving for women, and that's great, that is not true for racialized women, and it is not true for Indigenous women. It is also not true for racialized and Indigenous men. But the kicker in all of this is that many boards in all universities have diversity policies, right? In 2018, 81% of directors in a survey felt that their boards were diverse. Universities think that they lead in diversity, right? And so we need a real shift in culture and broader systemic change if we want these numbers to move. If we want to close the gap, we have to come at it from every angle. And we have to recognize that we often define equality and diversity, and also what constitutes adequate reform, through the view of people of power. If we defined it from the view of people who are powerless, we will get very different answers. And with that lens, I hope you can see where I'm starting to lead in terms of the framing of corporate legal discussions, and in the context of what are worthy debates. So, what led me to be quite zealous in my desire to present to corporate boards inequity, diversity, and inclusion over the past several, I think almost 5 years now, along with my friend Shona McGlashan, was this puzzlement we had over all the diversity initiatives that were taking place. The policies, the public statements, yet the numbers don't seem to move much at all. And we've realized that you can have the best policies, but what happens is that something occurs at the local level which circumvents whatever clear policies you have. And these barriers can be indicative to me of where we are at conversations in the boardroom on climate risk and obligations, and also in corporate legal reform. Right? Like overt sexism and racism is easy to reject. We're almost grateful for these stories because we don't feel like we're a part of them. But we also have a responsibility as academics and boards and management in particular to be aware of the systemic barriers faced by women, people of color, and other historically marginalized groups, which gets reflected back to us in terms of who's in the room and whose voices are heard. And again, which issues are identified as problems, how those problems are solved, and whose interests we deem worthy of protection. Many are familiar with the glass ceiling, invisible barriers that prevent women and people of color from reaching the top. Researchers have found that women are actually punished when they succeed in traditionally masculine endeavors. Another depressing study found that women and people of color who demonstrated strong diversity valuing behavior received lower performance ratings than white men who demonstrated the same. Glass cliff, when women and visible minorities tend to be placed in positions of power in times of crises, when there's a high probability of failure, so they're set up to fail. Motherhood penalty, working mothers encounter systemic disadvantages in pay, perceived competence, and benefits relative to childless women and dads. The term maternal wall, these stereotypes are based on past, present, or possible future pregnancies, which enforces workplace discrimination. What that means is that even if you don't want children, the fact that you could one day has been shown to work against you in hiring rounds. The idea of on-ramps and off-ramps, women taking off temporary periods of time to address familial responsibilities, face enormous penalties and are often lost in re-entry. Gender and racial devaluation, quote unquote, female occupations are regarded as less valued and prestigious than men's. Studies have shown an increased proportion of women in an occupation has a net negative effect on wages. Folding into that is also prove it again bias. Women and visible minorities have to work harder to establish competence. White males are often presumed to be competent. Any mistake is a lapse, a fluke, whereas women and visible minorities have to prove their competence over again and again, and mistakes are remembered far longer. Daily tightrope. Women frequently have to navigate the tightrope between being perceived as too masculine or too feminine. We live in a very binary world, and the intolerance that transgendered people face is a real testament to that. The conflicting messages that we get to be ambitious but not bossy, confident but not too confident, or I'll sound hostile or arrogant or bitchy. This trickles down to the way we socialize children. Girls are expected to be caretakers. Boys are the ones who deliver a return. If you want to create value for your company, the confidence to take calculated risks is a necessary skill. Placing everyone else's needs above your own is not. And this type of stress also falls along racial lines. When speaking out may make some racialized people immediately labeled as an aggressor or a bad minority. It's about self-preservation. It can be emotionally taxing for Black, Indigenous, and racialized people, and women especially. And it can be challenging then to be taken seriously in a field where you bring up issues of critical importance that may not be taken to be such by virtue of those delivering the message. Okay. Internalized misogyny, we need to understand that gendered biases and systemic barriers are not ones that men inflict on women. We all inflict them on women. The studies are pretty consistent in that women and men both hold these implicit biases. You can work in an organization where the leadership is mostly female, but internalized misogyny runs deep. White supremacy, this is a concept that I know can make people uncomfortable, but I think the Black Lives Matter movement has really helped people recognize the systems we live in. Here in Canada, I believe there is a deep reluctance to talk about race until it's as blatant as murder or hate crimes caught on video, which we can all easily say we oppose, right? It's much easier for people to be disgusted by those acts and compartmentalize them as isolated events until they finally come to a head. There's this false sense of Canadian exceptionalism that forgets our very own racist history and our present day systems that are shaped by that history. You know, we need to be honest about Canada's history of colonialism. Britain colonized half the world, and here in Canada, we had the 60s scoop in residential schools. Last one closed in 1996. We had 200 years of legalized slavery. We had Japanese Canadian internment camps. We had the Chinese Head Tax and Exclusion Act. We had Komagatu Maru, Africville, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, which continues to this day. Here in BC, it's well documented. This is a booklet that came out in February, recounting some of those histories. I actually moderated the book launch, and it's publicly available for educators and scholars to increase their awareness of our context. And, you know, you ask, what does this history reveal about the structures and institutions that are central to our social, political, and legal systems, including our corporate cultures and corporate law? And how then can we best reform these structures and know that misogyny, white supremacy, these notions cut across gender and racial lines? You can be Asian and have strong white supremacy preferences, you know, maybe some you're aware of, but also many you're not. So, you know, we need to recognize intersectionality also, and an intersectional understanding of lived experiences and social categorizations, including gender, race, sexual orientation, age, religion, disability, ability, you know, they're highly relevant in the context of power and different forms of privilege, you know, situatedness and context. And so, you know, for those of us with privilege, in thinking about what we can do, you know, there can be sometimes a great deal of defensiveness, but to reset that for people, you know, I love this quote from Kara Ing and Salem, who state, you know, the language of privilege implies excess or surplus of something that needs to be taken away. But the right to live a life free of oppression is not an indulgence. Rather, it is an existence that we should all be able to enjoy. And let us be clear that we do not begrudge those who have lived their lives free from racial and other forms of discrimination. We just hope that they are fighting alongside us for a world where that fundamental tenet of human dignity is secured for us too. And so in sitting with that, and thinking about the challenges that we face as a society, the challenge I feel for corporate law, you know, the question I have is, how do we get from here with the trajectories of old debates reverberating and taking up time and resources, which we have in scarcity, and the narrow framing of corporate legal scholarship of what constitutes reform, you know, to here? UN General Assembly adopted these Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, supported by 193 countries. Climate change, biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, unemployment and underemployment, food and water crises and fiscal crises, future pandemics. These have been named by the World Bank as some of the greatest global risks facing the world. And these concerns are accelerating the need for new and sustaining relationships to bind our global community. And upending the status quo on corporate behavior is critical if we ever want to come close to reaching these goals. You know, I don't think I need to convince anyone here that our mental models are being seriously challenged by the complexity, scale, and speed of climate change. And our analytical approaches are increasingly failing to tackle these challenges. As most businesses have experienced during the pandemic, the level of global interconnectivity and interdependence of the economic system has revealed some deep vulnerabilities, not only in relation to contemporary capitalism, but in our societies. And, I have here the 3 dimensions of sustainability that we need to focus on. Because corporations, again, they're creatures of the law. They rely on the law for their existence. So you would think they would be directly accessible for regulation. But contemporary business practice is characterized by deep complexity and opacity. I teach my students about limited liability, asset partitioning, control and governance decoupling, financial engineering, all factors that have dire implications for regulating business to achieve sustainability because of the difficulties and, in some cases, the impossibility of identifying who or what is in control. Jennifer Quaid and I are thinking about how corporate law has allowed for the fragmentation of accountability. Right? So it's essential that law and policy integrate the realities of corporations' unsustainable practices. And this past dependence we've had on this disconnection between economics and ecology has now come to a really uncomfortable reckoning in scholarship and industry. And so my research engages in systems thinking for corporate regulation, which is aided by the beginnings of Kate Raworth's economic model, where the donut of social and planetary boundaries acts as a human compass for, a compass for human progress, right? So in her model, our planet's environmental ceiling consists of 9 planetary boundaries advanced by Johan Rockström and his team, beyond which lie unacceptable environmental degradation and potential tipping points in Earth systems. And the 12 dimensions of the social foundation in the middle there are derived from those internationally agreed upon minimum social standards set by the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And between the social and planetary boundaries lies an environmentally safe and socially just space in which all of humanity can thrive. And Beate Schaafgel and Christopher Brunner note how, real corporate sustainability must ultimately involve corporate, legal, and governance structures promoting practices that contribute to, and at a minimum, do not undermine society's potential for achieving the overarching goal of sustainability, which they define as securing the social foundation for humanity everywhere, now and in the future, within the ecological limits of our planet. So Raworth's new economic approach has gained the attention of the UN General Assembly and has really forced a reconsideration of past economic theories of growth, requiring traditionally free assets of natural resources to be viewed by corporations as assets within a circular economy, meaning a regenerative system where product life cycles operate in a closed loop. Donut economics is still an embryonic approach, and in many ways it's unfinished. Further development of this model is necessary in the context of corporate law and governance. The next few decades mark a real critical period in domestic and international legal and regulatory reform. As we have these legislators and industries setting their sights on a post-pandemic world. And our goal is for our legal and regulatory systems to move businesses into that identified space. And how do we do that? And in asking that question, that question to me should be a priority in corporate law reform. And it may require a changing of the guard in corporate law, in law and economics, and changes in leadership and power to change the trajectory of the questions we ask and the resources we spend and the brain power we expend to help us get there. And so the work the CCLI is doing, to me, is critically important in terms of the changes within the structures that we've designed. But in the meantime, we should also be challenging those very structures, because that's what led us here, right? And the fact that we are now simply reacting to the negative consequences of that it doesn't sit well with me. And I don't, I know with confidence, actually, that I don't think relying solely on the business case is going to get us to net zero. The CCLI is making the legal case, but my challenge posed is in making the ethical case as well. Kelly Testi wrote a paper on linking progressive corporate law to progressive social movements. And I think there's a case to be made here, which challenges our existing norms and structures, both internally within our corporate cultures in terms of systemic barriers, and in terms of the very way we've built these structures. So, those at the forefront of the business world understand changing risk appetites and global megaforces that are now compelling them to act as responsible corporate citizens. We're hearing from world leaders, institutional investors, even the bankers. And, more importantly, our children are joining in to sound the alarm, right? Recognizing that this failure to act is complicity. And whereas in the past, climate change was often portrayed as this fear-mongering political tool, the discussion has changed dramatically in the face of limited time, greater public consciousness, and tangible evidence. And we're watching, really the rule of law in action, right? We're watching the next generation expect more from their institutions. We're training the next generation of lawyers that have grown up under a climate emergency and now a pandemic. Businesses and governments are being sued for ignoring their stakeholders using a variety of legal avenues, including plain vanilla tort liability. To date, almost 2,000 climate lawsuits have been lodged around the world. Increased business and human rights litigation is being leveled against corporations, including specifically towards large multinational corporations operating outside of their central home offices. The growing tide of lawsuits against governments and corporations has led to ripple effects in legislation and industry standards, and boards are putting their companies at risk if they do not consider the environmental and social impacts of their actions. The business, legal, and ethical cases are clear. And lastly, in my last minute, I want to say that we need to amplify our youth. They're going to bear the greatest share of the burden, but they are not the ones currently in power to make impactful decisions about it. And for millennials and Gen Z, environmental and social crises have defined much of their adult lives, along with this recurrent message that time is of the essence. But I promise you, they are not stuck in a mental box here. And this book, which will be in the spring catalog of McGill Queen's University Press, amplifies the voices of a diverse group of young lawyers with some of the most refreshing ideas on corporate law. And there's nothing more humbling and rewarding than having the next generation teach you something. So as our planetary problems have intergenerational effects, the solutions and paths forward, they must also include intergenerational voices. And I'll just end by saying that humanity faces some formidable challenges, and it's in no small part thanks to the blind spots and mistaken metaphors of outdated economic and legal thinking that we've ended up here. We need to learn how to discard old ideas, how and when to replace them, how to learn, unlearn, and relearn. Now is a great time for unlearning and relearning the fundamentals of corporate legal thinking so that we can keep the world inhabitable and sustainable for future generations. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Liao. That was a tremendous presentation that gave us a lot to think about.